Hello. This video is a continuation of our look at the life of Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha. When we last left our hero, you will recall that he had just left his life of privilege and isolation from the real world in the great going forth. He was 29 years old, and he decided that he needed to go out and experience the real world and pursue the life of a religious person, to try to come to some sort of conclusion, some sort of answer to the problem of suffering and the meaning of life. And so after leaving his life of privilege, he goes out and he cuts off his hair and he takes on the clothes of a poor man, and he finds a teacher. And so he finds a great yogi, and he spends time studying under this man. And after a very short period of time, he comes to grasp the full extent of the wisdom of his teacher. And his teacher says, "I've got nothing left to teach you." And so the teacher invites him to stay on and help teach, but he goes and he finds another teacher. And so he finds another great yogi, and he studies with him. And the same thing happens, that after a short period of time, he grasps the full wisdom of this other school of Hinduism, of yogic discipline, but still finds it unsatisfactory. And his teacher says, you've surpassed where I am, you should take over and teach. But he decides that that's not right. And so you find in the story, what's being communicated is that the contemporary schools of Hinduism were inadequate. The Buddha explored them, he fully explored them, and he found them inadequate. And so then he goes on and becomes an ascetic. And that is to say, he takes on a life of extreme deprivation. And so he goes off with a few other ascetics out into the wilderness to discipline the body and to meditate and to try to see through the illusions of this world and reach enlightenment. And he does this really hardcore. In terms of depriving the body, it's said that he would survive on 1 grain of rice per day, and the only thing that he would drink was the dew that was present in the morning. And he became so thin that when he would reach into his stomach, he could take hold of his spine. And these extreme ascetics would do things like build 4 fires outside in a field and then sit in the middle of the 4 fires there in the heat of India to meditate. So there's this extreme disciplining of the body. And sometimes there are images of the Buddha that show him, actually he's not the Buddha yet, right? He's still Siddhartha Gautama, but show him at this point in his life. And so if you look up images of the Buddha, you will find Siddhartha Gautama at this point when he's an ascetic. And all of his ribs are showing, and you can see that he's just really skin and bones at this point in his life, spending time in meditating, and being very serious about this, taking asceticism as far as you can go with it. And so this is Siddhartha Gautama at this point in his life. So while he is a super ascetic, serious guy, he's not finding the answers. He's not finding the solution to his problem. And then the story goes that one day he's meditating when he hears a music teacher, perhaps a sitar teacher, teaching his student. And this teacher says to the student, when using this string instrument, when tuning this stringed instrument, if the string is too tight, it will snap. And if the string is too loose, it won't play. So he overhears this conversation from a music teacher to his pupil. And at this point, Siddhartha has this great breakthrough, this great realization, right? That the answer, the truth, is not found in the extremes. Right? And so he understands this lesson metaphorically. And so the answer to life, the answer to what he's searching for, is not found in the extremes. It's not found in the extremes of a life of pleasure, and it's not found in the extremes of asceticism. There is a middle way. And so Buddhism has talked about the middle way. And it refers to a lot of different things in Buddhism, and we don't have a chance to really explore that at this point. But Buddhism then becomes a path between asceticism and pleasure. And it becomes a way that is between that of the isolated individual, the wandering holy man all by himself, and the householder, right? The person who has a 9-to-5 job and a family. And so you're going to find Buddhists later living in community with one another. This is also part of the middle way. So at this point, the Buddha has done it all, right? He's had a life of luxury, and that wasn't right. He studied yogic disciplines of Hinduism, and didn't find them fully satisfactory. He became as much of an ascetic as anyone could, and that was unsatisfactory. And so he finds that I got to figure this out. And so he goes and he decides that he's going to sit under a tree, and he's going to stay there, and he's going to meditate there under that tree until he reaches the answer that he's been searching. And if he should die there under the tree, then so be it. And so he sits under this tree, the Bodhi tree. And this is what you see behind me here in Bodh Gaya in India, and allegedly the tree under which he sat. And so he sits under this tree, and for days and days he's meditating. And as time goes by, he's making progress in understanding the illusions of this world, overseeing the illusions of the world, seeing into his past lifetimes, understanding the laws of karma. It's slowly, he's making progress. And then on the seventh day, as the morning star is rising in the sky, as evening gives way to night, and he has this nighttime depth of experience, and then in the morning he reaches enlightenment. And so it's there after 7 days underneath this tree, as the morning star appears in the sky, that he attains enlightenment. And he doesn't actually get up. He stays there under the tree for 6 more weeks. And so he continues his meditation, deepening his insight, deepening his enlightenment, so that he's there a total of 7 days under this tree. And it's after this, as he gets up, that now we can refer to him as the Buddha. And the Buddha means the awakened one. And that's what the word means. So Siddhartha Gautama has now become the Buddha, the awakened one. And he's about 35 at this point. He spent about 6 years from the time of the Great Going Forth until this point. And then for the rest of his life, he goes around teaching people. And there's all sorts of stories and accounts of what he taught. And we'll get to that in another lecture. But he spends the rest of his life teaching people what he came to understand under that tree. Now, fast forward until he's 80 years old. And the story goes that, and he's 80 years old, there was a blacksmith named Chunda who gave him some food to eat, which is customary, right? Buddhist monks would go out with their bowls and ask for food from the community. And so Chunda gives him some food to eat, not realizing that what he had given him was either spoiled or it was poisonous mushrooms. There's different versions of the story. And so the Buddha takes this food and eats it and becomes very ill. He's 80 years old, he's eaten this tainted food, and now he's dying and he's on his deathbed. One thing that I think is a little bit interesting in the story is that it said that the Buddha knew that the food was tainted, but didn't want to turn down the offering of Chunda. He wanted Chunda to be able to make this offering, and he wanted to receive it graciously. And so even though he knew it was tainted, he received it and ate it anyway. And I always thought that was a little odd because, from Chunda's perspective, yeah, you wouldn't want to have your offering of the Buddha turned down, but you really want to be remembered for 2,500 years as the guy who killed the Buddha. So in any case, Siddhartha at this point is on his deathbed, and his followers, right, are coming to him to see him, and they're very sad, of course, that he's going to die. And so he comforts them and he speaks to them and reminds them that everyone, ultimately dies. The Buddha, after all, right, is a person. He's a human being. And so while there will be different versions of this later on, at this point, this version of the story, he's a human being and he's going to die. So he tells his disciples this. And he tells them a few interesting things right before he dies. One of the things that he tells them is, he says, look, I've told you everything. I haven't held anything back. I've revealed everything to you. So there's no secret knowledge in this tradition, right? This is not a Gnostic religious tradition. All the information that you need is out there and you have access to it. So that's one thing that's interesting. And then according to certain versions of the story, his final words before he died, I want to read to you. That he calls his followers to him and he says this to them. So you must be your own lamps, be your own refuges. Take refuge in nothing outside yourselves. Hold firm to the truth as a lamp and a refuge, and do not look for refuge to anything besides yourselves. But these are the final words of the Buddha. I think this is really interesting, and I want to just read through that again and have you think about this. Think about how this compares to other religions that you may know about and what they teach. And so here you have the final words on his deathbed of the Buddha to his followers. He says, so you must be your own lamps, be your own refuges. Take refuge in nothing outside yourselves. Hold firm to the truth as a lamp and a refuge, and do not look for refuge to anything besides yourselves. So you may notice that this really stands in contrast to what you can find in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, right? In those religions, God is your refuge. God is the light and the lamp, right? And you find this expressed in the Hebrew scriptures very clearly. And so in those traditions, the idea is you have to take refuge in God. That is where you need to take refuge. And if you go to the extremes of Protestantism, the teachings of Calvin and Luther, it's like you can't do anything on your own. You have to completely take refuge in God. And here you have a religious teacher saying the opposite. Take refuge only in yourselves. Don't look anywhere outside yourselves for refuge, but only look to yourself. So when it comes to different religions, I find sometimes people will say, well, all religions are basically the same. They have different stories and their ethics might differ a little, but they teach you to be a good person, to be loving, to follow the golden rule or the silver rule or something like that. But they're all doing basically the same thing, teaching the same thing. And I don't think that's true. I think that you have a distinct and interesting difference here. When students go to college, right, a lot of times they might take a world religions class and start thinking about these questions. And they think, well, which religion do I really think is right, right? People should think about these things. And I think one of the factors to consider when you're thinking, what do you really believe? What religion makes sense to me? Or do any religions make sense to me? Is what do you believe human beings are capable of? If you believe that we are ultimately powerless to overcome the limitations in our nature, that human beings have a corrupt nature and we can't overcome that on our own. We can't be good enough to make ourselves right with God or to save ourselves. Then certain religious traditions are going to make more sense. If you believe that human beings would have within them the power and the potential to discover the truth, to reach enlightenment on their own, then the teachings that you find here with the Buddha are going to make more sense. They are saying different things. And so I think a lot of what it boils down to is, what do you think you're capable of? What do you think we human beings are capable of? Do we need a savior? Do we need someone to save us? Or do we have within us what we need to attain that ultimate goal? So you, of course, are free to reach any conclusions that you want, but there is a real difference in these religious traditions, and I think that that's worth pointing out. I want to share a couple photos with you quickly. One of them is a famous depiction of the Buddha underneath the Bodhi tree, and you see him here meditating. And when he was there, he was facing a lot of challenges, right? There's this demonic-like figure named Mara who comes and doesn't want him to attain enlightenment. And so he sends his hot-looking daughters to dance in front of him and try to seduce him and distract him, but that doesn't work. And he fires fiery arrows at him and he challenges him. And so the Buddha is not just trying to figure out the meaning of life, attain enlightenment, but he's dealing with this individual, this demonic figure who's opposing him. And you'll notice that his right hand here is reaching down to the ground. And the story is that when he was facing these temptations, and Mara is saying, why do you think you can do this, which no one else has done, that Siddhartha touches the ground and calls upon the earth to testify to his worthiness. And so you'll see many depictions of the Buddha with his right hand extended down, and that's the point in time that this represents, underneath the Bodhi tree, calling upon the earth to testify to his worthiness. So that's one famous depiction of well, he's still Siddhartha, I suppose, at this point. And then the other is the reclining Buddha. These are found a lot in Thailand. And this is the Buddha reclining on his right side after he's spoken his final words right before he dies. So you have the Buddha at the end of his life, reclining and finishing his last lifetime. Right? He's transcended the cycle of birth and rebirth. And so you have this great serene individual who is passing on into parinirvana, final ultimate nirvana, with the passing of his final lifetime. So these are some other images that might be good to see and to understand. Now, a lot of times people are thinking, what about the fat Buddha? What about that big rotund fellow? Well, we may talk about that later, but he's not the Buddha. The guy that you're thinking of, that's not actually the Buddha, Siddhartha But that brings us to the end of his life story. We're going to consider in the next lecture some of what he taught. And so we're going to look at the Four Noble Truths in the next lecture, which is a really fascinating topic. So meantime, I hope this lecture was clear. Give me your thoughts, your complaints, your feedback, and as always, take care of yourself and those people around you. Until next time.